Ministers, distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the first day of the OECD conference, Technology in and for Society. My name is Ulrik Vestergaard Knudsen. I am Deputy Secretary General here at the OECD. Science, technology, and innovation is part of my portfolio, and it's a real pleasure, and I'm proud to moderate first this opening session and afterwards the high-level roundtable. Over the next 2 days, we will hear about the transformative potential of emerging technology, and we will explore values, design principles, and mechanisms for the responsible development of these technologies. Our program today will begin with remarks by our Secretary General here at the OECD, Mathias Cormann, followed by Philp, UK Minister for Tech and the Digital Economy. Secretary General Cormann, Mathias, the floor is yours.
Merci beaucoup, Ulrik, cher ministre, chers collègues. Merci de m'avoir invité à inaugurer.
Thank you very much, Ulrik. Thank you, ministers, dear colleagues. Thank you for having invited me to inaugurate this webinar on technology and in and for society, innovating well for inclusive transitions. We are living in a time of unprecedented change. The COVID-19 pandemic has reshaped our economies and our societies. It has catalyzed an extraordinary leap in the adoption of e-commerce, remote working, and distance learning that enabled us to avoid a complete standstill.
The pandemic also demonstrated the centrality of science and technology to address global challenges. The global science and technology community quickly mobilized to establish new research initiatives worth billions of dollars. Vaccines were produced in record time. Innovative firms reacted swiftly, spearheading innovations in medical goods and services, from developing apps that facilitate remote patient monitoring to using robots for high exposure tasks in hospitals and many more. While new and emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, synthetic biology, nanotechnologies, and quantum computing can all play a critical role in tackling key policy challenges and improving opportunities and living standards, they're also disruptors, raising risks and ethical concerns. For example, while new developments in gene editing can facilitate major leaps forward in agriculture and health, they also, of course, come with significant downside risks. While blockchain technologies promise a revolution in business models and transaction transparency, they also call into question decades of global regulation of financial markets. Designing and implementing good technology governance is as important as developing new technologies. But this is not an easy task. Traditional means of governing science and technology are ill-suited to capture the pace and depth at which innovations are reshaping our economies and societies. Public trust can also be difficult to earn when information about new technologies is highly technical and where there is a lack of faith in regulatory institutions. Public acceptance and trust in new technologies is not a given. How to ensure that these technologies are developed and governed in ways that protect our shared values, security, human rights, the rule of law, equality of opportunity, and indeed, democracy itself. New approaches to technology governance are needed. And the OECD is leading the way by fostering dialogue and developing new ways of thinking about how to do technology governance. For example, the OECD recommendation on artificial intelligence is the first intergovernmental standard on AI. Launched back in 2019, it underscores the need for a stable and resilient policy environment which promotes a human-centric approach to trustworthy AI. G20 members have adopted the G20 AI principles, which are drawn directly from the OECD's recommendation. The 2019 OECD recommendation on responsible innovation in neurotechnology is also the first international standard in its field. This recommendation helps countries and stakeholders anticipate controversial developments in neuroscience and direct path-breaking technologies towards the most important societal goals. And earlier this year, OECD members adopted our recommendation for agile regulatory governance to harness innovation, which sets forward ideas for establishing resilient and future-oriented regulations for new and existing technologies. Today's conference is an opportunity to reflect on these instruments and discuss key principles and approaches for responsible innovation. Let me highlight three key priorities. First, through collective horizon scanning, we need to anticipate governance issues early in the development of a new technology, rather than waiting until it has fully matured, when it is often too costly and too difficult to change trajectory. Second, we must also embed key values of social responsibility and human rights as early as possible in the development of emerging technologies, based on open and inclusive processes. This approach helps reduce uncertainty for businesses and build trust with society, which in turn supports a more predictable, flexible, and resilient business environment that can foster innovation. And finally, we need to advance international cooperation, which is critical for mitigating the risk of policy fragmentation around technology governance, while facilitating coherence across technology ecosystems. At the OECD Ministerial Council meeting in October, OECD members reaffirmed these principles, highlighting the need to develop and strengthen standards for new and emerging technologies which reflect our shared values and keep pace with innovations reshaping our economies and societies. The OECD has also been supporting global dialogue on technology governance in the G7 and other international fora. At last week's Future Tech Forum in London, we organized a high-level session on technology governance. And Minister Philp will have some more to say about this important event in a minute. As part of this ongoing dialogue, this conference seeks to develop a framework and policy agenda to pair the transformative potential of emerging technology with the necessity of good governance. Des mécanismes de gouvernance bien pensés peuvent être et doivent ouvrir la voie à une innovation responsable, à savoir une innovation porteuse de transformation qui soit productive, réactive et digne de confiance. Les technologies nouvelles et émergentes contribueront à façonner l'avenir de l'humanité et ce n'est que grâce à l'innovation que nous serons en mesure de réaliser un avenir sans carbone. Les efforts déployés aujourd'hui et au cours des prochaines années seront déterminants pour les générations à venir. Je vous souhaite un débat constructif sur ces questions importantes. I wish you an excellent discussion. Thank you so much for listening to me, and apologies for the technical issues at the beginning of the speech.
Thank you so much, SG. Thank you, Mathias, and not least for putting the spotlight on the need for international cooperation, where, of course, we hope here at the OECD, under your leadership, to play a continued, if not an increasing role. And I think a part of that was perhaps we laid the foundations for part of that last week in London, and this is the perfect segue to you, Minister Philp. Very good to see you again, and a big congratulations on the successful Future Tech Forum that Mathias also alluded to. Last week in London, I had the pleasure of representing the OECD there. We hope that it will be marking the beginning of increased, also institutionalized dialogue on some of these issues. So with that, Minister Philp, Chris, over to you. Pleased to have you with us.
Wonderful, Ulrich. Thank you very much indeed for that introduction. It was very good indeed to see you last week, and thank you so much for speaking so eloquently at the Future Tech Forum in London. And thank you, Secretary General, for your introduction a moment ago, and good morning to everyone. I'm very pleased to be able to join you today and have the opportunity to provide some further opening remarks to set the scene for today and tomorrow's discussions. I'd like to warmly congratulate the OECD for hosting this conference. It comes, as Ulrich said a moment ago, just a week after the UK hosted the Future Tech Forum in London, which was announced earlier this year at the G7 Leaders Summit in June. And I'd like to thank again the OECD for their support and involvement in that event. And once again, Ulrich, thank you to you for coming and speaking so powerfully to us. I'm also very pleased to see the OECD bringing to life those discussions through not only conferences such as this one and its ongoing support to the G7 and G20, but predominantly also its work on a number of recommendations that will help guide governments and stakeholders in their commitment to ensure tech governance brings tangible social benefit, critically underpinned by open, free social values. It is almost an understatement to say how much we now rely on digital technology. Over 80% of the world's population now owns a mobile device, and almost 2/3 are accessing the internet. In the UK, nearly 9 in 10 adults and 99% of 12 to 15-year-olds are online. As digital and emerging technologies underpin ever more aspects of our lives, how we choose to govern them will have huge implications for our prosperity, safety, and society. Technologies are rapidly transforming our economies and our everyday lives, and responsible governance is critical to reaping their benefits while managing potential risks. It is increasingly challenging, I think, for existing governance regimes to deal with the pace of technology innovation while addressing societal and economic concerns such as privacy and security, as well as digital competition and online harms. It's a critical that we as governments strike the balance in the right way. To this end, the UK has shown international leadership. We have been working to develop groundbreaking legislation to meet these challenges through our regulatory approach to online harms, which includes an online safety bill, which will be introduced to Parliament very shortly, digital competition regime, which will be publishing very shortly, and telecoms diversification, to name a few. By telecoms diversification, I mean making sure that our supply chain is safe and secure, and we're not unduly reliant on a small number of suppliers. And in digital competition, we're very keen to make sure that players with near monopolies are not abusing their market position in any way. But our domestic and international responses clearly need to work together to realise the opportunities and deal with the risks. No one government can tackle these challenges alone. This has to be a collective endeavour, and we will need to ensure that the frameworks are in place for government, industry and civil society to work successfully together so we can ensure that tech governance keeps pace with the technologies it is governing, and it's done in a way which is flexible, promotes innovation and economic growth, but is transparent, accountable, protects consumers, respects individuals' rights, and puts open society values at its heart from the outset and takes a person-centric approach. That is why the Future Tech Forum last week explored how we as governments should seek to collaborate together and with our partners across the digital and tech ecosystem to identify and get ahead of the tech policy challenges of the future. We debated how countries around the world are considering how technology should be governed both domestically and internationally by working through multilateral fora and international organizations, reflecting how digital technologies are both borderless and fundamentally changing the geopolitical landscape, and how, given the pace of change is so fast, we needed to get ahead of the tech curve using more anticipatory governance, including always a multi-stakeholder approach. We discussed how we can earn long-term public trust and rebalance the narrative to embrace data use as an opportunity for the benefit it brings, for example, in healthcare, in driving innovation, and in bringing prosperity. We also talked about the future of the internet and the need to recognise and react to the challenges and opportunities of the next decade to champion a free, open, and secure internet. A positive vision based on open society values is needed to counter alternative visions that may produce fragmented, centralized, or restricted networks That doesn't serve anyone's interests, in my view. We looked at how digital technology can help accelerate our journey to net zero, and how investment in the global tech commons, connectivity and shared data can help build climate efficiency across the entire global community, bringing more people online and increasing digital
I spoke to this
access.
guy named Mark Valentine. His
And
brother
finally,
was...
we explored the impact of digital tech on improving health outcomes and the lessons we have learned from the huge wave of innovation unleashed by the COVID pandemic. This also included ethical questions around human augmentation and nanobiotech, and how it will impact the life of every person on Earth, from the modification of the human body to bespoke personalized medicine. The rulebook that we create for these technologies will therefore be one of the most crucial things we do in the coming decade, and it is only one we can create together. I'm therefore pleased to see that today's and tomorrow's discussions are focused on the inclusive and anticipatory design of these emerging and converging technologies, ensuring upstream governance and building on the lessons from the past. I welcome Deputy Secretary General Knudsen's remarks at the beginning of day 2 of our forum in London, and the need for policymakers to continue to come together and get ahead of the curve rather than reacting after the event, and his reiteration of experts' calls for urgency when we seek to understand and tackle the ever-evolving space of technologies. As Baroness Martha Lane Fox, one of the UK's great tech founders, reminded us last week, the pace of change we are experiencing now is the slowest it's ever going to be. What she means by that is that the pace of change tomorrow is going to be even faster than today, and the pace of change the day after that faster again. So the pace of change will only ever increase from where it is here today. As a result of that accelerating pace of change, getting ever faster from today onwards, it is incumbent on all stakeholders and like-minded governments to build greater understanding of tech and its implications for government and society. This includes shaping international mechanisms and structures for their development, application and governance to ensure we have agile, responsible and resilient regulatory frameworks reflecting a multi-stakeholder approach where a wide range of voices are heard. The OECD has, as always, been an instrumental partner in this debate. The UK has been proud to help drive the OECD's world-leading initiatives, from the AI recommendations and agile governance principles and the Global Partnership on Artificial Intelligence, GPI, which the OECD has been supporting, to those initiatives under the current data governance horizontal project, such as the revised recommendation on children in the digital environment. The United Kingdom looks forward to continuing to help the OECD deliver innovative, groundbreaking guidance and discussing shared approaches together to tackling key technology issues of tomorrow through future iterations of the Future Tech Forum. It's essential that as tech develops, open, free, and inclusive values are at the heart of technology. It's open to us as free-thinking countries around the world to shape how that develops and make sure that the values that have served our country so well for so many centuries are protected, perpetuated, and strengthened as we think about technology in the future. And on that note, Deputy Secretary General, I'd like to wish you and all the participants an extremely productive conference today.
Chris, Minister Philp, thank you so much. And let me thank both you and Secretary General Mathias Cormann for your forceful, reflected and very thought-provoking remarks. It's the perfect start to this conference. I also heard a lot of like-mindedness and alignment between what you said and what Mathias said. And by the way, there's also a lot of alignment between what we discussed in London a week ago at the Future Tech Forum and what we're going to discuss over the next couple of days. And let me assure you that here at the OECD, we really look forward to continuing our cooperation with the UK and others as we try to follow up the Future Tech Forum and build perhaps more of an institutional dialogue together with you and like-minded countries and perhaps others. So thank you so much. we'll let the Secretary General and the Minister go. We can't do applauses teleworking, but thank you so much. And we will be reminded, of course, Chris, that this is the slowest moment in the rest of our lives, with Martha Lane Fox's words. With that, thanks. We will transition into our high-level roundtable. So allow me to kick us off with just a few remarks. Over the last 2 years, we have seen a major pandemic threaten our health, our economies, and also greatly disrupt our daily lives. Staying in the UK, I read a British expert this morning in the New York Times saying that the new Omicron variant reminds me that perhaps we're closer to the beginning than the end of this pandemic. Not very optimistic, and let's hope he's not right, but it certainly goes to underline that we are not about to exit this. In parallel to this crisis, we're facing a number of cascading environmental crises, from climate change to the loss of biodiversity and also other environmental emergencies. Transforming systems such as health, energy, and mobility will take not only good ideas, but also political will and certainly innovation of all kinds. Emerging technologies, whether digital, material, biological, or perhaps even all three, can make an enormous difference. Just think about, from biology, how the successful use of the mRNA vaccines in the fight against COVID-19 actually helped us thus far in the pandemic. But developing and scaling up emerging technologies can have social, political, and ethical challenges, and it can also lead to disruptive consequences. For example, the digital transformation, obviously so important for driving our modern economies, carries threats to privacy and increasing inequality. And also the prospect of human augmentation through neurotechnology raises new questions of human rights, and automation is changing the face of warfare. For this reason, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, along with a number of related agreements, urge countries to foster innovation and technological development within a broader set of goals and values, such as poverty eradication, responsible innovation, and inclusive and sustainable growth. In short, how do we ensure that technologies are developed and used for the common good? Our first session today will pick up this question, share different perspectives on values, governance frameworks, and policies that are needed to realize the potential of emerging technologies. I now have the pleasure of introducing our very distinguished panel. We have with us today, recorded in a recorded session, we have Minister Hyesook, Korean Minister of Science and ICT. We have Mr. Roberto Cengolani, Italian Minister for Ecological Transition. Dr. Yuko Harayama, Executive Director of RECON, a large scientific research institute in Japan. We have Manuel Heitor, Portuguese Minister for Science, Technology and Higher Education. We also have Mr. Jean-Éric Paquet, Director General of Research and Innovation at the European Commission. We have Esther Lynch, who is the Deputy General Secretary of the European Confederation of Trade Unions. And last but certainly not least, we also have Mr. Jason Kelly, CEO of Ginkgo Bioworks. That's a biotech company from the United States. A very, very warm welcome to all of our speakers. I look forward to a lively and interactive discussion. So let's jump right in. The challenge today and in the future is how to leverage the power of emerging tech to achieve the transformations we need and to manage the downside threats to core values. We want to hear how you all deal with this challenge from your own experience and perspective. Our first speaker, Korea's Minister of Science and ICT, Lim Hyesook, has shared her views via a short pre-recorded message.
Thank you, Chair. I'm delighted to take part in this meaningful conference where we share our views on how to promote values-driven STI. My sincere appreciation goes to our host, the OECD, CSTP, and BNCT. The COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated digital transformation, while the rapid technological development has triggered unprecedented economic and social changes. Also, global challenges like climate crisis have emerged. All these circumstances call for STI to play a bigger role than ever before. STI is a core mechanism for tackling these challenges. In many countries, including Korea, policymakers are struggling to develop ideas on how to sustain national innovation while using technologies to address diverse social needs. Similarly, the OECD is also actively discussing values-driven technological development, inclusive technological transitions, mission-oriented innovation policies, and upstream technology governance. I hope today's conference offers us the chance to share insights and explore solutions to the problems ahead of us. I would like to present a Korea's case in regard to this, the Science and Technology Basic Plan of Korea. It is the overarching 5-year plan that suggests the mid to long-term direction of Korea's STI policies. The 5th version is currently in development to be implemented from 2023 to 2027. The direction highlighted in this version is addressing national and social issues through anticipatory governance. First, future predictions are crucial to preemptively respond to risks in today's society where complexity and uncertainties are growing in all areas. To this end, Korea developed Science and Technology Future Strategy for 2045 last year. A survey on potential future issues in science and technology is also underway. Based on such predictions and strategies, we have derived the 4 main priorities of the basic plan: national innovation, economic recovery, inclusive society, and the survival of humanity. Policy goals and implementation measures for each priority are currently in development. I would also like to emphasize that the following are necessary to address national and social issues with the STI: setting appropriate policy targets, choosing effective policy measures, and guaranteeing participation of multi-stakeholders. For example, in the case of regional STI policies, enlarging local R&D investment has been the main goal so far. However, in the face of local population decline, Korea will shift our focus on helping develop economic and social viability of regions, and to produce tangible outcomes, proving the effectiveness of policies in terms of quality will be essential, instead of the quantity of investment and research. In the 5th version of the plan, there will be more than just R&D, talent nurturing, technology transfer, or other traditional policy measures. Participation of stakeholders other than science and technology experts will be welcomed. We will encourage experts from diverse disciplines and citizens from different social groups to express their views and take part in policy making. The final draft of the 5th Science and Technology Basic Plan in Korea will be confirmed later next year, as it will reflect the recommendations in the Innovation Policy Review of Korea, which is currently in development by the OECD. Member states' interest in this will be greatly appreciated. Before I wrap up, I'd like to emphasize that global cooperation for promoting values-driven science and technology is the key to addressing global challenges and sustaining national innovation. I look forward to more robust dialogue and cooperation in the future. Thank you.
Well, thanks to Minister Hyesook for these thoughts to begin the roundtable. I think that Korea's close attention to the relationship between technology and society really sets the perfect tone for this panel. I now turn to our live panel, and the first speaker up is Italy's Roberto Cingolani, Minister for Ecological Transition, to share his views. Minister Cingolani, you preside over a ministry dedicated to the ecological transitions. What is your approach and your experience in trying to harness emerging technology while at the same time managing the potential downsides? Thanks for being with us, Minister. The floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Ulrich, for the question. Well, you know, my background is in science. I've been a scientist for 38 years before becoming minister, so I naturally have the I'll say numerical approach. And I think when I started my mission as a minister of the ecological transition, I tried, first of all, to have clear numbers in mind. It seems to be very clear at the moment that we have 4.8 billion people in the planet producing 80% of the greenhouse gas, and another 3 billion are left with really nothing. I mean, maybe 1 billion has no access to electricity, 2 billion have no access to clean fuel to cook, and approximately another billion has no access to clean water. So, and not to mention the digital divide that is possibly even worse. So the first thing was clear to me is that the transition, this moment of transition towards the decarbonization, has different definitions depending on the country. So local circumstances are so different that we cannot claim there is a unified solution, nor there is a digital solution as many would like, that you press a button and you get a solution. That's not at all. I mean, I would oversimplify saying that if we will be too slow, we will miss the Paris appointment and we'll have a climate crisis that will be unprecedentedly important. But if we will be too fast, we will have a social crisis that will be, again, unprecedentedly strong. So time matters a lot in this moment, and the derivative of our change, so the speed by which change will be made will be crucial to maintain simultaneously social order or social sustainability and climatic sustainability. In some sense, I think energy, at least for the next decade, is the driver. And we should start from the global numbers. I mean, if you see the total, the primary energy, the total energy that the planet, humanity consumes every year is in the range of 160 millions of billions of watts every hour in a year. I mean, at home, you have maybe 3,000, 4,000 watts. So you make your calculation very easily. And the point is that only 20% of that total energy is electricity, and only part of that is produced by renewable sources. So the real problem we have is that we claim we want to make a green society, keeping our growth rate, at least in the advanced countries. But we do have to face a problem. We have to face a problem that is huge. We are gonna change, we're gonna swap our energy, primary energy production in the next decades, transforming 130 millions of billions of watt every hour into renewable. I mean, this is nothing we can do with the existing technology. So my first point is that we might have a good map, a good roadmap to 2030, in which we aim at transforming all our electricity into renewable electricity to enable electric mobility transformation, electric manufacturing transformation, electrification of all sectors. But this is really 1/3 of the total power. What about the other 2/3? I mean, right now we all depend dramatically on fossil fuel, and with the existing technologies, it will be very hard to make the transformation in an easy, well, I mean, maybe easy is too much, in an affordable way. So clearly, this has to do with the 4.8 billion people in the G20. On top, you have to consider that if we want the rest of the population, the rest of humanity to grow, we need to provide them at least another 40,000 terawatt-hour per year. And you know, this is something that is not accounted for so far. So we will need extra energy to let the other grow, unless we really believe that we can keep them confined in a place, not giving them the opportunity to grow, not giving them the opportunity to lead their countries. So this is really a gigantic social problem. Technology, of course, is the answer, but technology has to be driven properly in terms of regulation, governance, and of course, innovation. So on one hand, we need to provide 40% of the population of the planet with an extra 25% of the total energy. This means developing new energy sources, energy communities, accumulators, possibly small modular reactors to produce nuclear energy with relatively low cost and little radioactive waste. We need to develop digital technology because we have to manage a smart network to operate simultaneously with different non-programmable sources. And of course, there you will need water technologies. You will need crop genomics because, of course, agriculture is going to pay quite a bill for the climate change, for the drought, and so on. And then we will need, for sure, One Health approach. I mean, we have seen in the COVID what is the difference when you put all the humanity working on a vaccine, but then you see the difference. I mean, 99% of the vaccinations have been in the rich countries. We're not doing enough for the other countries. And of course, biotechnologies. On the other hand, we need to swap all our energy system into electric and renewable. We need to develop for the 2050 carbon capture technologies that for sure not those we have today. What about catalyzing carbon dioxide from the air, transforming into calcium carbonate or any other solid material? I mean, we all know that by 2050, it has to be net zero. It doesn't mean zero, because now we are 9 billion. We are no longer 1 billion like 200 years ago. And we have changed completely biodiversity. I might touch this later. What about circular chemistry? We need to transform waste into something useful. We are not investing enough. So circularity and transformational chemistry will be a key technology for the future. Clean, massive energy sources. What about fusion? What we're doing today for nuclear fusion is by far insufficient. In 40 years, we need to have fusion as the main energy power sources. We cannot really believe that we do this with wind power, geothermal, or solar, and so on and so forth. And what about accumulators? Who goes beyond lithium? Do we really believe that in 2040, with 60% of the cars around the planet being electric, we can still manage with lithium batteries the entire business? Not at all. So in some sense, I think that we are now 30 years before the completion of the transition. And if this were a digital transformation, today we would have a telephone connected to the wire, and we would make our plan for the next 30 years, still considering having a telephone connected to the wire. Whereas we know this is not the case. Technology goes very fast. Humans are slower than technology. And we need to have a clear vision about the future, hoping that the forthcoming technologies will be really much better than those we have today. So the main point is to invest in research, development, innovation, culture, and education, and of course pursuing as much as possible the targets of Paris Agreement, not forgetting that till we have global inequalities like we have today, the ecological transition will never be beaten.
Thank you so much, Roberto, and we really appreciate your miracle approach here at the OECD. It's also our preferred approach. So thank you so much for that, and pointing to the carbon divide, the digital divide, the vaccine divide. You've thrown so much in there. So what a great start to the panel. Dr. Harayama, I turn to you now. You sit at the head of one of the preeminent research organizations, not only in Japan, but actually a world leader in a variety of scientific disciplines. What is your perspective on how to achieve technological change that's both responsive and responsible?
First of all, thank you so much for having me on this roundtable. Let me start by saying that the relationship between technology and human has evolved and continued to evolve over time. And in the hunter-gathering era, technology emerged as a tool for human to benefit the fruits of nature, key value being sustainability. In the agrarian era, technology became a means to work on the nature, allowing, by the way, the emergence of what we call today society. Later on, in the industrial era, technology became a means to organize mass production, inducing, by the way, the division of labor and the certification of society, driving value being productivity and efficiency. And today, technology fueled by data is offering to people new means to interact, to be connected, to influence, and to control. Sharing became imperative, giving the illusion to be present anywhere, anytime with anybody, while leaving the feeling of isolations and loss of personal anchorage to the community when we are offline. So by the past, the time scale was different. Technology has shaped the society and has been shaped by the society in an interactive way. Society had time to adjust its functioning and its underlying value system to the technological change. But today, with the accelerated rate of technological advancement and the ever-expanding scope of technology with potential to impacting the being of humans and ourselves, think about the potential use of AI, gene editing technology, or neuroscience, as mentioned by the minister. That is to say that technological disruptions is occurring beyond the society's absorption capacity. And the promoter of science and technology, we should not only address scientific and technological challenges and respond to the practical social needs that mean to be responsive, but we should explore and work on the social values on which our future will be built with an enlarged science and technology community, which include ordinary citizens. And we have a collective responsibility to do so. And nowadays, with the ascendance of geopolitical discourse within the area of science technology, the adoption of this approach became crucial and urgent more than ever. So no doubt in this context, sustainability remains one of the foundational values. We, as a promoter of science technology, need to build a sense of community by being inclusive and open to the diversity of ideas and voices, and staying humble. So that's for myself. And then I'm looking forward to discussing with all my colleagues at the panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Harayama. Thank you for pointing also to the issue of the social values. I sense that this is going to be a recurring theme today and tomorrow. We turn to Minister Hyesook from Portugal. You're responsible for setting the agenda and implementing science and technology policies for Portugal. How does your ministry address the challenge of pursuing research and development in ways that might promote technology for good? Thanks for being with us. The floor is yours, Minister.
Thank you very much, Ulrich, and thank you all for participating in this event. I will argue that the key issue in our lives and in the coming decades is to guarantee that citizens at large are an integral part of science and technology development. And why is this? If we look back at the last 20 years, Europe at large, but the OECD at large, is stagnant in terms of the overall investment in R&D and in innovation. And we should worry about this. Certainly, some social scientists, including Sheila Jassanov, that will speak later in the conference, have argued that countries, in particular OECD countries, do not invest more in science and innovation as a question of a crisis on authority. We know that science leads us to the truth, and the question of the beliefs in science should worry us. Certainly, we should look why the OECD countries in general have not been able to increase over the last 20 years the overall investment in R&D. And that is the reason why the question of bringing citizens to the center of new developments will be critical, because governments in our democracies, usually, they have to follow what citizens, with the beliefs of citizens. And the idea that actually, as Roberto Cingolani very well expressed, an enormous opportunities but challenges for technological challenge, we know that citizens need to better understand these challenges because we don't have enough knowledge and we need to invest more. Again, we should remember that in European context, 20 years ago, in the Lisbon strategy, it was adopted to achieve by 2020 3% overall investment in terms of the GDP. We have not achieved. Europe is almost stagnant in 2%, and now we have renewed these targets to increase, but in 10 years' time, because to face the critical challenges of the ecological transition and making use of the opportunities of the digital transition, we need more knowledge. Certainly, we need more institutional innovation, as clearly addressed in the many of the OECD reports, as well as new observation methods. If you ask me how we are doing this, and actually Portugal is a medium-sized country, and we have successfully increased our overall investments. In 2015, Portugal invested about 1.2% of GDP. The last figures is about 1.6, and we are increasing in a rate so that by 2030, we can have, in fact, 3% of our GDP invested in R&D, particularly with 2% from the private sector and 1% from the public sector. But these do need clearly to diversify our system and to densify the knowledge and innovation system. Particularly when I meant about diversification, the lessons from COVID were clear. If today we have a vaccine, or if we either in Europe or United States, was particularly the articulation of fundamental science with disruptive startups and entrepreneurial attitudes, which could really speed up the process up to which the fundamental knowledge associated with RMNA and other new molecular biology processes could be articulated with essentially new disruptive actors in our entrepreneurial landscape, certainly in articulation with the distribution of vaccines, which was achieved through large companies. But again, essentially, we live in new times because also we understand more than ever that we are facing the fragmentation of innovation-based growth, which is critical for us to understand. And in fact, there is not only one way to innovate. And we know certainly that to excel in each stage of production and of innovative production, we need very different innovation capabilities and very different ecosystems that support them. Certainly looking from zones from Silicon Valley of the East Coast, but also in Europe, looking at the most innovative Italian regions either in the north or south, or giving to the Nordic countries, or some of our most innovative regions in Portugal. We need to understand that innovation in the real economy do need to follow different patterns and certainly understand the way citizens are engaged in this overall process to allow us to increase the overall investment and to make the necessary effort to strengthen fundamental research as well as to speed up disruptive process. And this is a great challenge for all of us, certainly for governments, for national and governments, for the Commission itself. And I should call the key importance of the New Horizon Europe program in Europe based on 5 critical missions, again, with the idea that by bringing together citizens focus on critical missions could be an important issue to engage more and more people to understand the challenges we face. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manuel, and thank you for sharing these reflections, not least on knowledge, innovation, and research, so important, of course, to this discussion. We turn to Director General Paquet. As a world-leading funder of science and technology development, what action is the EC or the EU, the Commission, taking to help align technological development with societal goals and missions?
Yeah. Ulrich, hi. Well, funder, but also research policy. The European Commission does not only fund research. Yes, we have a big program called Horizon Europe. Manuel just referred to it, 95 billion over the next few years. So it does have impact, no doubt about that. But we're also trying, together with the 27 EU member states, to deploy a European research area. And of course, the instrument and the policy framework really come together. And with one key purpose, which is to give direction to Europe's research and innovation effort. I think we are outstanding in science. We are better in innovation than this is sometimes debated, but that's another discussion for another day. But what really matters is indeed to ensure that these efforts across national research and innovation systems with that European layer really produce meaningful outcomes for society. And in that context, whilst obviously the digital transformation is going to be absolutely at the center of the effort to ensure that the values which underpin European research are properly reflected also in digital innovations and technologies, the political point which I want to make today, and was made already by previous speakers, is that we need more than ever to ensure that our policy response to climate change, and I think COP26, based on the IPCC report, based on science, largely European science, but of course global science, indicates without any doubt that essentially climate change is driven by human activities. More than 80% at least of the warming is linked to human activities, and that the urgency of acting against CO2 emissions is greater than ever. There's no way that we wait for 2050 and the long-term plans of many of our partners to achieve climate neutrality. We need impact and reductions by 2030. And that brings with it two requirements. Firstly, to continue to invest in science and technologies, because we have a number of solutions which are today available, but not all of them, even for the 2030 objective. So I think more investment across our systems in energy, mobility, waste management, heavy industry technologies is absolutely essential. But that needs to come together with two specificities, which are not always at the forefront of research and innovation. The first one is to connect it with social innovation. Technology will get us only part of the way. The transformation of our societies is as important, both in terms of picking up the technologies, but also in transforming in themselves the way we are set up as societies, including lifestyle choices, for example. So connecting better research and technologies with social innovation. And the second dimension, I think, which is absolutely essential, is that we carry out research having at the outset an eye on deployment. Developing great technologies which then don't find their way into the market is just not on. If you look at the urgency of climate change, biodiversity loss, and environmental degradation, there's an absolute central feature of attention, which I don't think is central enough, even if, of course, in the OECD, this is very well identified, as you are covering very much also economic development as part of your mandate. We need to ensure that our research really produces outcome with deployment. And this is where, and I finish with that at EU level, we have on the one hand, major partnerships with national programs and with industry in digital and in industry related matters, where we precisely connect the research and development capacity of these players with then the capacity to deploy in the short term these outcomes in the economy and in society. And the second key development here in the Horizon Europe, but beyond it very much, are indeed the European missions. Manuel referred to them already. We have 5 EU missions, which have set very concrete objectives, having 100 climate neutral cities by 2030, a super tall order, or having 150 European regions adapted to climate change. And the idea here is that within these missions, we create a platform where you can connect research outcomes, so technology and social innovation, with the actors on the ground, local actors, cities or regions, which then can use these outcomes, these solutions, and deploy them to achieve these very concrete objectives. And cherry on the cake, but politically, I think, relevant, but also operationally rather essential, and I'll come back to it in the next round of our discussion, do this with citizens so that the design is informed by the needs of society which can then also pick up the results more impactfully. Thank you, Ulrich.
Thank you so much, Jean-Eric, and also for broadening the view of what the European Commission does. Of course, it's not only just a funder; it's also a developer of policies. We turn to Deputy General Secretary Lynch from the European Confederation of Trade Unions. As a leader in the labor community, what do you think is the role of civil society and other groups in helping to ensure that technology will benefit and not harm workers and other groups?
So workers and their unions have a very clear vision for a world of work in which technology brings about decent work outcomes and where the profits, the productivity gains are properly shared with the workforce and with society. But we're not naive about this. We know it won't happen by accident. We know that used properly, it can change the world of work for good, but used in a wrong way, it can be exceptionally dangerous. Our concern is that there are some gaps in the conceptual framework in which this discussion on artificial intelligence is taking place. Let me explain what I mean by that. Let's take, for example, the idea of individual consent as a safeguard. We know for a fact it doesn't work. It didn't work under the General Data Protection Regulation. Workers are desperate for a job. They turn up. They do not negotiate on during their interview the terms and conditions within their contract. The majority of workers don't do that. And it's an absolute failure of moral understanding not to take into account the power imbalance between the worker and the employer that happens within the employment relationship. That's why one of the key messages we'd like to be included in the outcome of this conference is that individual consent is not a safeguard. Rather, what should be taken into account is collective consent. So the use of collective bargaining as a way to secure a flexible and yet properly safeguarding approach to the use of technologies within the workplace. The second conceptual difficulty we identify is this move towards using the word human-centered and away from a human in control. We have no problem with the human-centered approach. There needs to be a human-centered approach, but make no mistake about it. We want to see that the use of, for example, artificial robots powered by artificial intelligence. It must never be the case that the workers who are interacting with them can't turn those machines off to be safe. It should never be the case that a machine has ultimate control over a human being. And that's why we would see within patents, patents should not protect machines that have control over humans in an inappropriate way. We understand that the use of technology is hugely dependent on the environment into which it's placed. One of the concerns we have about artificial intelligence is the development of highly invasive monitoring techniques. Take, for example, you and I, we go to hotels, we check in. When we get up to our bedrooms, we get a text message or an email saying, "How was your check-in? Was it smiley face? Was it unhappy face? What was it?" So there is already an intention to monitor the emotions of the workers by the customers. If you put artificial intelligence into that, we'd have cameras looking at workers all day, every day. And it won't be enough that workers do their jobs. They'll have to deep fake happiness while they're going about doing those jobs. And that is deeply inappropriate and should be prohibited. Finally, then, we see employer accountability for the use of these as being critical to their successful deployment. On the one hand, we want collective bargaining. We want the workers fully informed. We want them able to interrogate to ensure against discrimination, to make sure that men's pay doesn't continue to grow over women, to make sure that newer entrants, migrants, are not disadvantaged. There's so much research indicating that in the use of artificial intelligence. And on the other hand, we want to make sure that employers don't seize this, those unscrupulous employers who every time there's a new innovation, either in work organization, let's take, for example, the online platforms, but now for artificial intelligence as a way to pretend they're not really responsible for their workforce in the way that the laws intend them to be. We need to make sure that these tools are not used to exacerbate that meta trend. But make no mistake about it, we're on board for technological development. We want to be included in it, but we want and see that being done safely through collective bargaining. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Esther, for giving the labor market perspective and for the positive approach to that, given everything you've said. Finally, let me turn in this first round to Dr. Kelly from the United States. Your biotech firm, Ginkgo Bioworks, is a pioneer in the field of biotechnology, and you recently went public. Congratulations on that, Jason. Bringing the perspective of the private sector to the discussion, how would you address the question of what values and policies you think are needed to help guide a technological transformation? Thanks for being with us, Jason. Kelly, you have the floor.
Thank you, Deputy Secretary General, for hosting this important meeting. It's really an honor to be on this roundtable with all of you. You know, the SG mentioned in its opening discussion, sort of AI, quantum computing, and synthetic biology as examples of emerging technologies that are strategic. I think in that list, synthetic biology is the one that people really don't know much about. And so I think part of the reason I'm here today is to share a little bit on that. Ginkgo is the sort of largest company in that space. We did just take the company public on the New York Stock Exchange, trading as DNA. We raised about $1.6 billion. It's the largest biotech IPO in history. Ginkgo is also the largest user of DNA printing in the world. So being able to make a custom piece of DNA in order to program a cell. And so I want to sort of explain just for a minute what that is so people can think about this technology and its potential impact. So the simple idea behind synthetic biology is you can sort of program a cell like you program a computer, because fundamentally cells run on digital code in the form of DNA, right? So a computer runs on digital code, it's zeros and ones. Inside of every cell, every microbe, plant, animal, bird on the planet is digital code in A, T, C's, and G's, DNA code. And you can read that code with DNA sequencing, DNA, you know, like the Human Genome Project, genomics. And then you can write that code with DNA synthesis, DNA printing. And when you do that, you go on the computer, you type ATCGGG, you hit print, and out of machines at our labs in Boston or around the world, that piece of DNA can be printed. And then you can install that, you can put that code into a cell to make it do something new, just like you would install an app on your phone, to draw the analogy. So to give you some specific examples of where this is starting to impact the world, I'll give you a couple. I don't know, for those of you familiar in the US, there's a product called an Impossible Burger. This is a veggie burger that when you bite into it, it bleeds, which is a bit weird. There's not a lot of blood in plants. And so what they've done at Impossible Foods is they've found the DNA code for hemoglobin, it's a protein that makes blood red, and they put that code into brewer's yeast like you would use to make beer. And then when you brew it up, instead of beer coming out, hemoglobin comes out. And you add that back into a veggie burger, and suddenly it smells right, tastes right, cooks right. And it's sold now nationwide in the US as the Impossible Whopper at Burger King, to give you an example of a technology that's really, I think, has a great opportunity for changing the supply chain in the meat industry. Second example, we have at Ginkgo $100 million joint venture with Bayer Crop Science to work on the challenge of nitrogen fertilizer production. So the way we get nitrogen fertilizer today is you pull nitrogen out of the air and you burn about 4 to 5% global greenhouse gas to combine nitrogen with hydrogen and make ammonia. You ship that to farmers, they put it on the field, you get a local runoff challenge, local pollution, and then you get a global greenhouse gas challenge with the fertilizer production. But you know, we all get to eat. Nitrogen fertilizer is very important. And that process, that Haber-Bosch process, I was a chemical engineer. It's like the pride of chemical engineering to produce that fertilizer. Well, there are certain crops like soybeans and other legumes that produce their own fertilizer effectively and run Haber-Bosch in their roots by having microbes that pull nitrogen out of the air and fertilize the crop. But corn, wheat, and rice, which is half of global synthetic fertilizer usage, they don't have those microbes. So what does synthetic biology do? Well, you use DNA reading to learn from nature. How do the cells in the soybeans produce that fertilizer? You get that code, and then you take microbes that live on corn and you program them, you add that code to their genome so that they too could start to fix nitrogen and produce fertilizer for the crop. And so that's an example of an opportunity where if that were successful, you could have a big greenhouse gas reduction and also help with local environmental problems on runoff. And the last example I'll give, mRNA vaccines have been mentioned quite a lot already today. Ginkgo did a project in March 2020 with Moderna. We did a follow-on project with a company called Aldevron, which is one of the big vaccine manufacturers in the US, to optimize the production of what's called vaccinia capping enzyme, which is an ingredient in mRNA vaccines. We increased that production a factor of 10 fold over a period of a year. That's an example of, again, programming a bacteria to produce an ingredient for those vaccines. So those are 3 different examples, from food to fertilizer to vaccines. And what's important is it's the same underlying technology enabling all those. And I'll finish by saying, Roberto Singliani mentioned, if you had thought 30 years back and looked and said, what will information technology be like, you'd still have sort of wired phones in mind. I think it's important as you think about where will synthetic biology impact. This is if you look at IT as the example, we could program computers to do many different things by just putting in new code. And if you looked at what they ended up disrupting, it was all the information technology industries, media, telecom, finance, communications, right? Well, that's because a computer is programmable, but what it does is move information around. Well, a cell is programmable in biology. You can put in new code, it does new things, but it doesn't move information around. It moves atoms around. It builds things. So synthetic biology will be disruptive like computers, but not to information technology, to the physical goods industries, right? Things like hamburgers, things like nitrogen fertilizer production, pharmaceuticals, electronics. Ultimately, these are all biotech industries. They just don't realize it yet. So I'm excited to talk about, I think there's a lot of opportunity in just a general form in this area and a lot of potential challenges as well. Excited to discuss them today. So thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Jason. Extremely interesting and concrete perspectives that you bring to the table. Only I'd say it's very, very unfair of you to talk about bloody, juicy veggie burgers this close to lunchtime when we still have almost an hour to go. But I'll check the OECD canteen to see if they have arrived here. No, thank you for being concrete. That this adds an extremely important dimension to our discussion. And I'd like to move into round 2 now that we've heard from everyone, and pose a different question, or maybe a set of questions, but the same one to all of you. From each of your perspectives, what do you think should be done both nationally and internationally to better anticipate technological disruptions? You've certainly anticipated some of them already for us, Jason. But also, what are then the specific policies and tools to ensure that they do actually provide benefits to everyone and are more inclusive? And I'll revert the order if that's okay with you, and start with you, Jason.
Yeah, so I think this is an absolutely critical question. So I'll speak from my experience. So the technology that we work in this area of synthetic biology, has a long and tough history in genetic modification, GMOs, particularly in the food space, right? So in therapeutics, my dad is a type 1 diabetic. He's needed insulin since he was a child. That was the first product of biotechnology that's been widely accepted, and I think had generally a good transition into the public, whereas GMO foods, for example, did not. And so we had here in the US a large debate, I guess back in 2016, around nationwide GMO labeling. And at the time, I wrote an editorial in the New York Times that said, "Look, I run a GMO company. I think we should label GMOs." Okay, and this was this is not the industry opinion at the time, that's for sure, in the US certainly. And the reason we did that at Ginkgo was our view was scientists and engineers like to think it's a problem of education, right? If we just educate the public, they'll understand, you know, the risks and rewards of these technologies. I disagree. I believe fundamentally it's an issue of trust. You know, do you trust the organizations deploying powerful technology to be acting in your interests? And the number one way to destroy trust is to be not transparent, right? I would like to know what's it, you know, if your technology is in my product, no, I won't tell you. Well, your assumption is then that technology must be bad for you. That's a quite reasonable assumption. And so I think one of the things that the private sector needs to keep in mind is that, you know, foundationally, transparency will be key with these technologies. We should make sure people are aware they're being put in their products. That's one of the ways we're going to build that trust. The second point I would make is I do believe that the crisis in climate change is going to really change the conversation around these emerging technologies. You know, my generation, frankly, is impatient with what's been happening in terms of the technological response to climate. I think what we have seen in the electrification of transportation, particularly over the last 10 years in the US, for example, Tesla, but the sort of drive that, hey, it turns out actually this technology change can happen rapidly if people collectively get behind it and governments work with the private sector to do it. We know that's possible now. People are not going to sit on the sidelines and allow technologies to be held back that could contribute to substantial greenhouse gas reduction when we're the generation that has to live with the consequences. So I think that is another area where I expect to see public pressure to move more rapidly with these technologies going to market. I think that is going to change. And then the last point I will mention, you know, Esther Lynch made some excellent points around worker participation in these technologies. You know, at Ginkgo, we're 35% owned by the workers of the company. They also have higher voting shares than shareholders who do not work at the company. I think this is one of the ways to help ensure technologies are developed with care. The people that work at a company, they are human beings who take pride in what they're building. They have a more nuanced view on how it would impact the world than just a shareholder of the company who didn't work there would. And so I think one of the ways to ensure the technology is deployed well is to vest power in the workers that are actually developing it and make sure they come from the diverse backgrounds of people that might be negatively impacted by it. And so that's what I would like to say there. So thanks again for your time, Deputy panel.
Well, thank you, Jason. I'll just, to reinforce your point, I'll just say that I came back yesterday from a conference in Rome where I shared a panel on climate change with 5 youth representatives. I found myself to be easily the oldest on that panel. That was scary enough. But I totally agree with you that the younger generation does not have the patience that older generations have. There is an urgency there that can be translated into real behavioral change. And I mean, look at the way we have behaved during this pandemic. It shows that we are actually willing to change our behavior, our consumption pattern, our social patterns. We're even willing to distance ourselves from each other and our loved ones if we perceive the threat as you know, real enough. And maybe that is a key, that the younger generations perceive this climate change threat more as more real than others. So thanks, Jason, for that perspective. I turn to you, Esther Lynch, basically with the same question on how we become better at anticipating disruptions and what policy tools are needed.
So throughout my working life, I've been constantly frustrated of how we're unable to anticipate change fast enough, or in a way that really helps smaller firms, medium-sized firms and workers to know where they fit into that change and to get whatever training or resources they need to be able to see how they will succeed in that change. And I think critically that's a role for universities, it's a role for governments to make sure that the information is available. What will the change look like? What's its practical implications for whether you're working in a supermarket or whether you're working in high-end coding? What's the world of work going to look like in the next 5 to 10 years, and how do you equip yourself for it? Then secondly, once you know that, the worst thing in the world. I meet so many workers who say, yeah, I know I need to go back in college. I know I need to get this qualification, and they don't have the time to do it, or they don't have the money to do it, or there's some other obstacle that could be removed in their way. And I think one of the really important developments during the time of COVID was the idea of the shorter working week. So people worked for 4 days. And a truly innovative and insightful, forward-looking employer provided training on the other day. So on the other day, workers could get access to training, were fully supported by their employer in that learning. And that's my final point about skills, because I hardly ever hear anybody saying it. I'm from a generation of workers for whom education wasn't always a good experience. That a lot of us went to school and didn't enjoy learning, and we were quite fearful of learning. I was in my 30s by the time I went back to school and qualified with a legal qualification. And so I think the opportunities for second chance learning are critically, second and third chance learning to be available to middle-aged and older workers has to be an essential element in all of this. For sure, we need to focus on young people and make sure that they're getting opportunities and chances, but also for older workers to have their chance to get qualifications that can give them access to the type of jobs that's going to allow them to provide for their families in a way that they want to. I think that needs to be a critical part of the anticipation of change.
Thank you so much, Esther. Reskilling and upskilling so tremendously important in this discussion as well. Back to you, Jean-Eric. Basically, the same question.
And maybe I can just start by saying that I don't think that the younger generations are more impatient than we were, honestly. I look at my children. What differentiates the two generations is the urgency. I think they're impatient because the urgency is so visible and the action remains too limited. And I think policymakers, and that's where I think the Green Deal in Europe is creating not just hope, but also action, is certainly one example where we are starting to make an impact. But we need more partners around the world to have a deeper impact so that by 2030 we have made a difference. And then, of course, leading us to 2050. I think there are many answers to your question, Ulrich. So maybe I will focus on two elements only. The first one is I think that we need to invest across the entire research and innovation system. Because we need knowledge, we need new science. And we also, of course, very well know that discoveries don't necessarily lead immediately to applications, but conversely, applications can then use longer term, more fundamental research and overnight result with an immediate impact. And I think the COVID vaccine is the best example. You have this European company called BioNTech. I mean, the vaccine is marketed across the world under Pfizer, unfortunately, not under BioNTech. But the science behind the vaccine, which is similar to the Moderna vaccine, is messenger RNA, as Jason explained a moment ago. And that BioNTech company is 20 years of science, of hard science. The founder of that company, Ugur Sahin, in Germany, is a grantee of the European Research Council, so Europe's equivalent to the NSF, which I call Europe's Nobel Prize factory. So he was supported as a fundamental scientist over 20 years, including by EU funding. And then they overnight, so to speak, they repurposed their knowledge into this highly effective vaccine. So I think investing across the research and innovation system is certainly absolutely key to be prepared. My second comment would be to say that indeed we need trust, transparency, and inclusivity in two aspects. Firstly, you need to devise science programs and priorities in a systemic manner. I mean, there's none of the issues which we are now discussing which can be solved by one measure or one even science discipline or one even within one sector. It's always systemic. And therefore, I think we need to invest into a governance of science choices where actors across disciplines, but also across the economy and society effectively come together to develop solutions and develop choices. And that's what we do in Europe under the co-creation of Horizon Europe. The second dimension of it is citizens. I agree with Jason that trust is a key dimension, but I would go one step further. I think one reason why there is a lot of concern, and maybe more in Europe than in the US, but I don't think this is non-existent in other parts of the world, is that science is decided in labs by scientists or by startups or in industries, but without necessarily a real dialogue with society and citizens. And I think the example of fertilizers and of gene editing some plants to generate more of these materials with limited impact on climate change, I think is a very good example. If the discussion with citizens at the outset was, this is not about just the bottom line of my company, but it's about making a real impact on emissions, it's then a technology which is looked at differently. If it's about creating a plant which is resistant to hydric stress and therefore relevant for climate adaptation, it's a completely different than producing a plant which then allows you to send to sell your pesticide. Just to make a slightly pointed reference. And I think that type of discussions with citizens is not happening. It's cumbersome. It is, of course, also, if you do it properly, you then need to listen to ensure that some of the choices are then translated in your own priorities. But I think if policymakers, research funders, but also actors of research were doing it on a more regular basis, I think this over time would also get society regain some of the lost trust in science which exists in many parts of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean-Eric. And maybe I wasn't clear. I was not suggesting that the next generation, I also have 3 grown-up daughters, are more impatient than we were at their age. But I think when we talk about the climate change, they have more of a sense of urgency than our generation today. I don't know if we can agree on that, maybe.
Well, I hope we have the same sense of urgency. Increasingly, I think we do. But I agree with you that they are much more mobilized and they are pushing us, and that's great.
Yeah. No, I'm glad you're impatient, at least, Jean-Eric. But maybe you're not the typical representative of our generation. Thank you also for bringing in this example from BioNTech with the Pfizer vaccine. That is actually also an example of
BioNTech vaccine. The BioNTech vaccine.
The BioNTech vaccine is actually also that example is actually also good in illustrating how cross-border cooperation is important, because it involves so many different nationalities. So not only is it a good example of EU-funded research, but also of cross-border cooperation on a globally crucial topic. Thank you so much, Jean-Eric. We go back to you, Minister Hyesook. Manuel, again, same question.
Thank you very much. Again, I believe I will follow a similar approach to answer these questions. We need, in my view, clear examples, because in abstraction, it is easy to write it down. And let me give you a different example beyond the health system, comparing the emerging new space systems, particularly in order to further develop space systems. And actually, if we follow up the last OECD report on sustainable development, the OECD is very clear in addressing the need of new observation methods. The only way to really implement new observation methods is through the integration of high resolution and very high resolution satellite image, particularly in low orbits, together with in situ sensors. And there is an emerging capacity for doing this, but again, we need to engage citizens in making that happen. Why? Because with the new space-related systems, we save lives, we prevent disasters, and we will be able to actually move towards carbon neutrality. It's important to note that the only way, for instance, to achieve the European goal, so-called 50 for 55, so it reduced by 55% CO2 emissions by in a decade by 2030, will require the online mapping of carbon stock in our lands, and essentially to guarantee the necessary carbon sequestration. This can only be done through a very detailed sustainable land management, also including issues of land resistance, and in a way that will prevent fires, which actually in the last summer has become a nightmare in many of European summers. Again, the only way where people at large will understand that we need to develop further in the new generation of space systems is to engage citizens in this context. For instance, the idea that every single city council and urban and lands authority needs to manage and to further develop new space-based systems for sustainable land management so that we can guarantee adequate carbon markets will be particularly critical to develop new markets, and with those new markets to foster the development of new space systems. We are looking at the emergence of new space constellations, but again, this will require also new science for avoiding what we called by voluntary collisions between space wastes. Again, this is an enormous scientific challenge which will be able to be addressed if we really are able to invest in new systems of artificial intelligence, combining with either ground radars or sensors in satellites to better control what we have in space. But I will say that the integration of high-resolution image for greening the industry and for prevent disasters, together with the protection of space assets, will be an area of a very interesting scientific challenge and uniquely to achieve the goals of carbon neutrality. And this is an example how science, technology, and innovation, together with fundamental understanding of and fundamental research and development, coupled with disruptive entrepreneurs and entrepreneurial joint ventures, can really help us moving forward, and certainly in a way that people at large can understand. But it must a completely change in the way we have looked at space. Space was developed particularly in Europe, but also in the West in the last 50 years, very much as an institutional market, and essentially from the supply of large companies to foster space exploration. And our challenge in the coming years is to turn it around and look at space to solve problems of people, and facilitating new actors, particularly entrepreneurs, certainly in articulation with the larger companies, but also make it inclusive and open in a way that institutionally it will require certainly the break of existing monopolies in the space transportation systems. What I'm telling is that engaging citizens at large will certainly require an evolving regulatory and new institutional landscape, which we know will face a lot of obstacles, particularly through existing monopolies, but is a must that we also need to look at existing agencies and really changing the current institutional context. And the opportunity is enormous for the OECD and the OECD countries in particular to make it happen in the years to come.
Thank you so much, Manuel, from bringing us from bloody burgers to sensors and satellites in space. It certainly is an expanding discussion. So thanks for those perspectives. I go back to you, Dr. Harayama, again, with the same set of questions. What's your take on it?
Thank you. Technologies are said to be disruptive because they emerge from out of the box and therefore unforeseeable by definitions. But they emerge very lowly from scratch, and most of them They are rooted in the existing science and technology knowledge base. So many tools have been developed to forecast technological disruption, classical one being Delphi method, horizon scanning, or through the exercise of technology road mapping. And today we are deploying AI and big data analysis for the same. But what's difficult to foresee is what will be the people's attitude, including workers and ordinary citizens vis-a-vis this technological disruption and the reaction of society. Also, how this technology will shape our future society. If possible, we want to prevent unexpected negative consequences. So to address these issues, the shift from technology-driven approach to human-centered approach advocated by the concept of Society 5.0 proposed by Japanese government will be our response. And also the global scientific community would exercise its responsibility not only as a guardian of science, but as one of the guarantors of our future society. And I think invest to nurture trusted relationship through dialogue with the public and the policymakers before technological disruption happen. So what is the key is preparedness. And we have to prepare the ground before the disruption arrive, and then to really make, as advocated by Minister Hector, engaging citizens, including workers.
Thank you so much. There is a lot of agreement and alignment around the citizen engagement and the worker engagement on the panel. We go back to you, Minister Cingolani, where we started. For your perspective on policy tools and how nationally and internationally we can better anticipate technological disruptions. Roberto, please.
Thank you, Ulrich. Look, for me, as a scientist primarily, not as a minister, I'm a minister since 9 months only, and I will not last for quite a long time. I think the first point is that we need to increase the investment in research and development at global level. You know, the world at the moment invests 1.74% of the global GDP, and this is primarily done by 20 countries. So this is a tremendous inequality. And at the same level, you've seen Jason. I mean, I love the speech of Jason. Lateral thinking. I mean, we need to change the way humans think. It's not a movie sentence. I'm seriously convinced. We need lateral thinking. That means in most cases for technology to copy by nature. You know, right now our educational model is very vertical. We should accelerate the global change of the educational model, starting from universities. Digital platforms may help, but they're not the solution, of course. Most universities still apply sort of vertical approach to education. We need a completely new approach. Just a question: you need to undergo an operation, a micro robotic surgery operation. You want to be operated by a medical doctor who has never seen a robot, or by an engineer who has never seen a human body inside. Or you have an accident with your Tesla autonomous car. You want to be defended by a lawyer who doesn't know anything about AI, or you want to be defended by an electronic engineer who doesn't know anything about law. I mean, these are paradoxes we're going to face in the near future. So we need to change everything, starting from the school programs and involving the young people in the decisional tables. I mean, recently, after the pre-COP, between the pre-COP and the COP26, we've made this Youth for Climate event with 400 young representatives from 185 countries. And it was amazing to see how the young people from all over the world gathering together, they can produce new, absolutely unexpected ideas. Now, as a provocation, I would say, increasing the world R&D investment by a specific campaign, bringing it at 2% and creating a few world laboratories for long-term human challenges. I mean, no one is thinking right now to the 22nd century. We are all focusing on the next 10 years, maybe the next 30. This is now myopic. It has been so like this in the past, but now everything is is different. The problems are global, are transversal. So I will start for sure with the high performance computing and of course quantum computing. We need to create the digital twin of the human body. We need to create the digital twin of the planet, like we do with cars and with aircraft. If you have a digital twin of a complex system like the human body, designing drugs, preventing diseases, correcting mistakes. I mean, I know that now sounds like science fiction, but you have to think in 70 years. We're not ready at all. We don't want even to envisage the future. The second is, of course, space. What we're doing now is fragmented. Okay, there are private, public, but it's so fragmented. What about food and demography? I mean, what Jason told us before is very interesting. Don't forget that in the 19th century, the mass of human was about 1/3 of the mass of the animals in the planet. After 150 years, the mass of humans is 10 times bigger. The mass of livestock is 3 times the mass of humans, and the rest of the wild animals is 1/3 of the mass of human. Do you realize what we did in terms of change of biodiversity, just because we want to eat only 3-4 species in the living world and maybe 10 species in the vegetable world? This is crazy. We need to face this. And of course, clean energy, and I insist on fusion. The nature is giving us the solution. This is what we have to do in the next 30, 40, 50 years, whatever. Well, the last point I want to say is that planet digitalization should create universal access to culture and science, and this has to be a primary right of humanity, just like freedom and health. This the easiest way to diminish inequalities, and of course, empowering public and private partnership in this would be fundamental. You know that as G20, we were supposed to raise 100 billion to help the vulnerable countries, and in 6 years we failed. That's ridiculous. But we also know that 100 billion is nothing. So we are aware that we need trillions every year to resolve the problem of the global inequalities. So I mean, finance has an important role in this, but it has to be clear and ethics. I hope nobody wants to make a finance that makes money out of the carbon dioxide, like in the past they made money on the real estate. So clear rules, transparent rules, and ethics in finance will help in the future. I think I said too much, but of course the challenge is really very big. We should not underestimate the role of future. No one has a minister of future in the world. I think this is a big mistake.
Thank you so much, Roberto. You certainly make sure that the discussion continues to expand not only in space, but now also in time, looking 70 years ahead. And maybe in the future, there is a future for you as Minister for Future. I think the Italians would be well served by that, Roberto. So this is the last of the second round, and we're moving towards the end slowly. We have 20 minutes left. And I'd like to see if we can get closer to some takeaways from today. I'll ask each 6 of our magnificent panelists to maybe briefly answer 2 questions. One is, what is the one message that you would like to convey to all of those listening in today? What is the one message you think should be the takeaway? And I know it's simplifying, given the breadth of the discussion today. And the other one is, of course, could you also design or assign some homework to us at the OECD? What is the most productive role you think we could play to help address some of these challenges? Is it in scanning anticipation? Is it in policy advice? Is it in perhaps designing principles for international cooperation, all 3? And which areas do you think we can help? That's what we're here for, of course. So Deputy General Secretary Lynch, can I revert the order a bit again and start with you? Is that okay?
It's not really reverting the order, in fairness.
Not reverting, randomizing it maybe, sorry.
So anyway, but I don't mind just starting with me. But look, I mean, the OECD and this panel proves it has the ability to bring together all of the key thinkers and all of the people with responsibility across the different actions that are going to impact on whether or not AI is put for good use or for bad use. from our point of view, it's absolutely essential that workers are involved in anticipating the change and in managing and implementing the change, and that they're fully supported and guaranteed a role to do that. And I think that the OECD being very clear with that vision would be hugely helpful to workers, and also in taking some of the insecurity and fear out of the system.
You're muted.
I'm sorry. I forgot to unmute. Thank you so much, Esther. Can I move on to Manuel?
I think Manuel left, Ulrich.
I'm sorry. Okay. But then while I have you there on the screen, Jean-Eric, can I ask you then?
Yeah, no, sure. Yes, well, I think 3 takeaways. One would be that we need systemic approaches, and that for public policymakers means a governance which is a whole of government approach, which is not often the case. I don't see many governments which are really connecting research outcomes with other public policies. And there are also not many governments which really work across public policy. So I think that's the first point, whole of government approaches. I think OECD is working on it. I would really recommend that you upgrade even further. You work on it so that we can find good practices. Maybe the European Commission can be one, but there are certainly a few, not many, but a few others. The second point is, again, with the purpose of being more systemic, is co-creation. Outside funders or government responsibilities to co-create with research actors and with society, and that's where citizens come in very much. This is also a governance discussion, which I think is really important, including with younger generations, our impatient younger generation. I think the traditional way of doing public policies, top-down or sometimes in representative democracies, I mean, they still are relevant, but they are not sufficient. And so I think co-creation from that point of view is really key. And lastly, I think this idea of directionality, I think we need, of course, to create research and innovation systems which have space for bottom-up, no doubt about that. But I think we also need, in a limited number of areas, to really give direction. And obviously, the urgency of climate change and biodiversity loss is a central one, no doubt.
Thank you so much, Jean-Eric. Minister Cengolani, Roberto, can I ask you the same questions?
Yes, I'll be very quick. I think science and technology will be the tools to reduce global inequalities. If we don't do this, we will have a very unsustainable future. So the message is R&D, S&T, whatever you want to call it, if we don't invest in that, starting with human intelligence, artificial and natural intelligence, it's anyway a good investment. We have to do this because we need for the future. And on the other hand, the take-home message for OECD, why OECD doesn't make a sort of a pilot experiment preparing a long-term future master plan for humanity? You are the only one who can do this.
Thank you very much, Roberto. We have left now Dr. Harayama and Jason Kelly. Dr. Harayama, would you like to come in?
Thank you. So to engage in multi-stakeholder conversations, I would say let's start with a reality check to observe what's happening on the ground. I would say because I'm based on my personal experience as a co-chair of a working group within the Global Partnership on AI, because we discuss about many things and future-oriented discussion, but the reality is that something happening today. In particular, I'm working on the future of work, and something that we are learning so much by looking after at the micro level what's happening. And then that's my recommendations. And also second one, if I may, listen to and work with young people. Because it should be their generation. And it's not up to us as a senior to really direct the attitudes, but it's up to them to really develop new ideas. And I will say OECD may act as a convener, providing space for experimenting new framework for the technological governance and sharing experience and also learning. Thank you.
Thank you, Tarek. Thank you very much for that. And we will end with you, Jason. Parting thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing I'd say is I think the development of mRNA vaccines and the time they were developed, and also what we've seen with the electrification of automobile transportation over the last 5 to 10 years in particular, suggests to me that when it wants to, government in partnership with private sector can move the needle. And if you look at the scale of the challenges in climate change, it's the only way it's going to happen. So I think the OECD can push that, right? You know, like the idea that there is a positive forward vision to solve some of these big global challenges, and that governments can be proactive, can actually say, this is what we want to have happen, and then go to the private sector and get what they need. That works. We just saw it work. And I think there's a real chance for leadership here. And frankly, it's needed.
Thank you, Jason. And thank you all 6 of you for being so succinct and precise. We actually have a little bit of extra time. So if there's any one in the panel who has an extra thought or a final thought or an extra reflection, could perhaps be on how do we engage, you touched upon it, Jason, how do we engage the public and the private sector together? I'm not going to put anyone on the spot here, but just throw it out there if anyone wants to go at that, or parting thought.
Yeah, Ulrike, I'll be happy to say, just maybe come back briefly to the
Sure.
European missions. The European missions, as I explained, I mean, we have them for cleaner oceans. We have them to restore the quality of our soils and our food. We have them on climate adaptation. We have them on cities, clean cities and climate neutral cities, and on cancer. So 5 areas which were set out politically, but they are obviously key areas in the public debate. We spent about a year to dialogue with actors across Europe to set concrete objectives for each of these 5 missions by 2030. And so if I take the example of the cities, we now have just launched a call for expression of interest to find 100 cities in Europe which want to be part of that mission, and which would then benefit from the collective knowledge which we have in Europe on these transformations, including portfolio of projects under past European programs and national programs. So we would make available this knowledge and these technologies. But the mission is then also about creating platforms to discuss at local level, city by city. And I don't know if panelists know the donut economy by Kate Raworth. It's one example where you can indeed have platforms and panels where you can discuss with actors in a local context, setting a clear objective, providing resources, knowledge, technologies, and investment resources, but then design the implementation plan with society. I think it's an interesting model because it combines the best of science, cross-cutting, technological, with a dialogue with society, and cutting across all policy areas at local level. So that's just started. It's a really big ticket item under EU policy right now. And I hope that it will indeed help 100 European cities to become climate neutral in 10 years. This would be an amazing outcome. And with that, of course, inspire many other cities in Europe and maybe beyond to accelerate their transformations. So that's maybe one way to bring together most of what we discussed in this panel.
Sure, that truly would be an amazing and inspiring outcome. Anyone else who wants to take the floor before I try to wrap up this quite diverse discussion? You're smiling, Jason. Any thoughts? No. All right. Dr. Harayama also smiling. But so if not, I'd like to thank all of you for extremely inspiring reflections and insights. It's not an easy discussion by far to wrap up, and I won't try to make any formal conclusions, but I think there are perhaps, for me, there are at least, let's call it 4 sets of takeaways. And the first one is maybe around the fact that in order to be successful in making these transformations inclusive and just, we need them to run across sectors, both in the private sector and between the public and the private sector. That's also where you ended, Jean-Eric. I've heard many of you mention words like lateral, like horizontal, like a whole of government. So I think one takeaway is that this common endeavor has to be horizontal. And we have actually taken pride at the OECD in saying that's one of the things that sets us a little bit apart maybe from other international organizations, that we are very horizontal, and we do not do only economics or labor or education or digital or research or climate here. We actually do all of it. So I hope that puts us in a good position to help in the future. The second takeaway is very broadly put about maybe anticipatory governance approaches, and that cuts across many themes as well. We've talked about up and reskilling, not least you, Esther, talked about that in order to anticipate what is needed for workers in the future. We talked about lateral education modes, and not least did we talk about the young generation from various perspectives. And I guess when we talk about anticipation, the young have to be part of it. Often they are actually our radars for the future. Some of us even brought our children into that discussion. A third set of takeaways is perhaps more a group of more societal conclusions from the discussion today. I wrote down a number of key concepts that were frequently mentioned in discussion. One is around citizen engagement. That is incredibly important. Another one was around transparency and trust. That was mentioned by several of you, how trust will be important going forward. Also social values, labor market issues and values. And then perhaps most importantly among these societal takeaways is the very, very, very strong need to invest more in combating climate change, also directional investments in STI. We're not going to get there without it. I think that was also a recurring theme. And then finally, the fourth one is that we do need more international cooperation. And some of you were kind enough to point to the OECD and our role there. You mentioned the convening power, the positive forward vision that we can bring to the table. That is actually what we're trying to do. There is, we are not going to solve climate change. We're not going to modernize our health sectors. We're not going to raise productivity to feed mouths. We're not going to combat the next pandemic if we do not have a positive vision of the digital transformation. And that doesn't mean we should not look at privacy, security, and digital divide issues as well. But we need that positive forward vision. I think we can help provide that. And then perhaps we should let Roberto get the final word. We will see if we can make an overall vision for humanity and the planet. Maybe we won't finish that by the end of tomorrow, but we're at the end of this panel, and I want to really, really thank you again for a very, very stimulating, rich, intelligent, reflected discussion. I enjoyed it a lot, and we're looking forward to other stakeholders later in the conference to weigh in. You've given us a tremendous start, lots of food for thought, and there will be a break now of around 15 minutes, and then we will reconvene at 13:40 with a keynote by Sheila Yasanov, who is a Forsheimer Professor of Science and Technology Studies at the Harvard Kennedy School. But maybe put our hands together for this panel. It's been really tremendous. Thank you so much.